because Islamic law allowed the ruler to make rules for the common good. It's just that it wasn't a pressing necessity for the ruler to organize everything.
Assalamualaikum warahmatullahi wabarakatuh. Dear listeners, welcome back to IAIS Malaysia podcast. Alright, ladies and gentlemen, today we are very lucky because we have with us today Professor Dr. Mohammad Fadel, a well-known Islamic scholar. Welcome to Malaysia, Prof.
Thank
and also welcome to IAIS Malaysia.
Thank you.
It's an honor to receive you here, Prof.
It's my honor to be here. Thank you.
Okay. Prof. Fadel, as we know, is a very well-known Islamic scholar. Right now, he is full professor at the Faculty of Law, University of Toronto, Canada. He's the former Canada Research Chair for the Law and Economic of Islamic Law. He researched and writes extensively on topics such as Islamic law, Islamic political thought, and Islam and democracy, among other things. So, the topic for our podcast today is political Islam at the next level. So, Prof, maybe we can start with some introduction, because when we're talking nowadays about political Islam or the relationship between religion and the state, where now I think we are far beyond the maybe what we call as a post-secular, that there is the thesis, the secular thesis that is religion is no longer relevant to the state. Is, I think now it's a foregone conclusion. Religion is here to stay. So now it's only a matter of how the relationship between the state and also the religion. So, Prof, when we're talking about political Islam or what we call Islamism, could you elaborate us first on what this thing means?
Well, that's an excellent question, because I think people throw around the word Islamism usually as a pejorative term to criticize a different group or movement. And so it doesn't really have necessarily much value as an analytical scientific concept. And so we need to be able to somehow distinguish Islamism as an analytical concept from Islamism as a polemical concept. So I will try to talk about Islamism as a analytical concept. So from an analytical perspective, I would say Islamism is just kind of the recognition that Islam is a political religion, meaning that it's going to say something about the political, about how politics should be structured, what makes a polity a just polity, what makes a polity an unjust polity, what are the criteria by which a government is legitimate and when it is not legitimate. And Muslims will have to take stands on these questions. And so in a certain sense, Islamism is one of the reasons why it's not useful as an analytical category and why it tends to collapse into polemics, is that every Muslim, by virtue of being a Muslim, is going to have to answer those various questions, right? So from that perspective, it doesn't have much explanatory power. I think what is more useful is if you talk about the different kinds of political theories of legitimacy that Muslims have adopted under the name of Islam. So different Muslim groups have elaborated different conceptions of what legitimate politics looks like from their understanding of Islamic teachings, right?
Okay, Prof. So the term political Islam is only served more like to elaborate what is Islam is about. It's not like to contrast with other version of Islam, for example.
There's no such thing as an apolitical Islam. That's what I would try to say. You know, in Egypt, there's a radio show on the national radio called Ad-Din al-Mu'amala. That religion is how you relate to other people, right? That's what I mean by Islam being a political religion. That it's impossible to be a good Muslim under any conception of Islam, Sunni, Shi'i, Sufi, whatever, unless you place yourself in right relations with other human beings. And so once you start talking about right relations with other human beings, automatically you're into the political. So political Islam is kind of redundant from that perspective. The only question is, what kind of politics do you think Islam requires? Now, of course, Muslims have given very different answers, right? But all Muslims have to ask the question and answer the question, what does it mean to be in right relations with other human beings?
So, Prof, when we're talking about the emergence of political Islam, is it because they try to highlight the what we call maybe an abandoned aspect of Islam during that time, during the background at that time, that they are now like abandoning the political side of Islam, so they try to highlight that make it, we call it
I would
political
say
Islam.
it became particularly, the issue of the political dimension of Islam became much more central in the 19th century as a result of colonialism. Prior to colonialism, at least in the Sunni world, I think there was a great deal of agreement about what constituted a legitimate Muslim public sphere. And so you had sultans, you had ulama, you had various bureaucrats, ahlul qalam, whatever, who served the states. And then you had the subjects who paid taxes. You had qadis, muftis, etc. So there was a strong consensus about what a legitimate Muslim public order looked like. That came to an end with colonialism for different reasons. First, in many cases, Muslim public orders disappeared because Europeans were now ruling Muslims, right? And as Muslims slowly began to reacquire independence, they now had to ask themselves what kind of institutions we want. And so because those questions, these political questions became salient in the 19th and 20th century in ways that they weren't salient before colonialism, because they were just taken for granted, right? And so that's why I think the term political Islam arose, because Muslims had different conceptions in the post-colonial period about what would make a state legitimate. And so you had some who viewed that what we should try to do is preserve as much of the pre-colonial tradition as possible. Others who said we should come up with new institutions based on Islamic sources. And then others who said we could just kind of adopt modern institutions and not worry about it, right? Now, each one of these views, I would say, is an interpretation of Islam. But only one of them ends up being called political Islam, namely the view that says we need to develop institutions based on the Quran and Sunnah, right? So those are the people, like the Islamic, typically the reformist movements, right, who end up being called political Islam. Well, in fact, all three have a theory of politics that they claim is consistent with Islam, or that Islam teaches.
Okay, bro, before we go into more detail about that, maybe we can discuss, or can you explain about the post-Islamism, what it's all about, so that we understand what the difference between what we call as political Islam or Islamism and the post-Islamism.
Yeah, people throw around this term post-Islamism. I don't really know what it means. I think it's trying to get to an idea of a certain kind of Islamism that flourished in the 80s and 90s, which might be usefully called utopian Islamism. So utopian Islamism sort of had the idea that we could solve our political problems, our developmental problems, by adopting the Sharia. And this would have it would kind of have a miraculous effect on our societies. It would eliminate backwardness, it would eliminate poverty, it would eliminate dependence on the West, et cetera, et cetera. So if post-Islamism has any kind of meaning, I think it relates to the weakening of this kind of utopian conception of the relation of Islam to politics. Otherwise, I don't see any case to be made that Islam as a political religion has stopped being relevant, right? So the way that I understand Islamism is just the idea that because Islam is a political religion, Muslims will have to answer questions about the relationship of the state to their religion, and that's an inescapable question. Again, if Islam were totally a private religion, if it only cared about your personal beliefs and your devotion to God, then politics wouldn't matter. But that's clearly not the case.
Okay, Prof, I think maybe we rewind a little bit because when you talk about Islamism or political Islam, you mentioned about legitimacy and all of that. I think it's beneficial if we know what the legitimacy look like maybe in the pre-modern world of Islam. So if we know that, maybe we can understand more about what this is all about
Right.
right now.
Very good. So I think there were different streams of legitimation in the pre-modern Islamic world, but I'll just talk about in the Sunni context. And here you have, I think, two primary streams of thought. One, you have the juristic theological stream of thought, and then two, I would say you have the Persianate Central Asian stream of thought. And the two are kind of in tension. The juristic tradition views legitimacy sort of in a ground-up, bottom-up fashion, in which you have the community appoint the caliph via an election, a selection process, which is preceded by wide consultation and then is confirmed by a freely given choice and bay'ah publicly, etc., and that the caliph has to meet certain legal qualifications of piety, of learning, of competence, etc. But so that's a kind of, you might say, a democratic or republican conception of the state, where the state's legitimacy derives from the choice of the governed. The Persianate or Turkish conception is more of a top-down model in which the ruler is kind of chosen by God as a charismatic figure, a special figure, somebody who receives divine blessings, and that divine blessings is manifested in his ability to sort of conquer the world, like Tamerlane or Genghis Khan, etc., and create a world empire because of his special charisma that God has given him. And then it's that ruler's duty to apply Islam because of his special role sort of in the cosmos. But his authority comes from above, it doesn't come from below. So these two theories coexisted, I think, in tension for much of the late medieval and early modern Muslim history. So if you look at Ottoman, symbolism, it appeals to both. It appeals both to the juristic tradition and it appeals to the Central Asian tradition. I think from what I've seen in Southeast Asia, it's more, the idea of the divine choice, etc., is very strong in the symbolism of the sultans of Southeast Asia, etc. But even in that model, right, there's a close cooperation between the ruler and the representatives of Islam. The difference is that the ruler does so out of personal piety. Because the ruler is pious and believes and is a Muslim and recognizes his duty before God, he then takes it upon himself to implement the Sharia. Whereas in the juristic conception, it's the community that's really the chief actor. So those were sort of the two main views, I would say. And there are important differences because if you accept the juristic view, then everything the ruler does is limited by the Sharia. Whereas in the second view, the ruler has a much more direct role, right? Because he has personal authority. Whereas in the first view, he doesn't really have personal authority. He only has authority that's given to him by the community.
Okay, Prof, I'm very much interested when you talk about the jurists, because when we read about the pre-modern Islam, we always found about the jurists, the central role of the jurists, like they play role as a maybe what we now call as a check and balance, and also they are the one that somehow confer legitimacy to the ruler. So how you find the role of jurists in the pre-modern era compared to nowadays in the modern times?
Uh, Very good question. I mean, you're right. In the pre-modern era, jurists played a much more visible and active role in actual governance. So they did this in a variety of ways. First, they served as public officials, most prominently as judges, but in many regions of the Muslim world, jurists were basically the only people with systematic education. So the wazirs of the ruler, the bureaucrats of the state, they would have even if they weren't jurists themselves, they had gone through Islamic education.
I'm
Right.
sorry before that, Prof. I think we need to clarify when we're talking about jurists right now. What we mean is like the religious scholar, the ulama, the
Yeah.
fuqaha, not like because maybe some modern in the modern time when we hear jurist, we think about the lawyer, and all of
Yes.
that sort of thing. Okay,
Yeah.
please continue,
Yes.
Prof.
So you know, judges and muftis were very important because that was the only legal system, right? And so they played an important role in adjudicating people's rights and also advising, objecting if the government acted illegally, etc. But we have to remember that also states in the pre-modern period were much weaker than they are today, and so they were dependent on obtaining the goodwill of the ulama, because the jurists played a very important role in persuading people to be loyal to the rulers, right? So they were, I guess you could call them reputational intermediaries, right? They vouched for the good faith of the ruler, if they believed the ruler could be trusted, etc. So the ruler had a good incentive to maintain good relations with the scholars, today. Jurists, I would say, are much more religious advisors. So in the modern world, because legislation that the state makes and regulations that the state makes have more or less displaced the Sharia. I mean, I'm going to put that between quotation marks because that's a complicated question. But what I mean is the ulama no longer produce the rules. The rules could still very well be Islamic. We can have another discussion about that. But the scholars no longer produce the rules. And so the role of scholars is no longer a technical one for applying the law. So, I do medieval legal history. So if you look at fatwas from the 14th century, 15th century, a lot of them deal with very technical questions of judicial procedure, right? And other sorts of things that today would be covered by a civil code or regulations. So as a result, their role in society has changed. They're much more, people look to them for religious advice. They don't look to them for advice about how to prove that they own a house, if you understand what I'm saying. So their roles have become much more circumscribed to, the narrow religious domain, right? You don't ask the mufti, I don't know, maybe I'm mistaken in Malaysia, but I don't think you ask the mufti about what standard of proof is required to show that a mortgage was properly recorded.
Yeah.
But that's what you would do in the 15th century. So the mufti would answer those questions actually more than the religious questions. Because the religious questions you had Sufi sheikhs to give you religious advice for, right? The ulama were much more concerned about the public aspects of religion, of the law.
So, Prof, when we're talking about pre-modern time, I think there's no like the separation between like what we call dunyawi thing and so the ukhrawi thing. All of them are under the purview of the ulama or the scholar.
They are, but I would push back against the idea that there was no distinction. I think there was a very clear distinction in their minds between those aspects of life that were ukhrawi, in the sense that we did it for the purpose of pleasing God, and those aspects of our lives which we did for ourselves, right? So I don't think anybody would confuse a question about prayer with a question about a commercial transaction, right? But the point is that the muftis answered both.
Oh, yes.
They answered both. And today, they largely answer only the first. They'll answer questions about prayer, about fasting, about hajj, about zakat, right? But they're not going to answer questions about, what happens if a debtor dies, and is his obligation become immediately due, or can it remain fixed into the future? These kinds of dunyawi issues are now resolved by civil law, for the most part.
Okay, I think another important part that you touch upon is on the legislation, or maybe what we can call the codification. That's another unique thing about the modern time, or the modern state. So how you see this codification? Is it like totally something new imposed from outside, especially from the West, or it is something that has its origin in Islam?
I think it's a complicated question, because I think the way Islamic law evolved internally, there's an internal dynamic that led to more and more attempts to create uniform rules that is similar to codification. So, certainly by the 13th century, 14th century, and the Common Era, 8th, 9th century of the Hijri, the madhabs had produced standard mutun. And these standards represented, what the madhab stood for. And the expectation was that a Shafi'i mufti would give fatwas according to the teachings of the Shafi'i school. And it was set out in this book. And the Maliki mufti would give fatwas in accordance with this book. And the Hanafi would give fatwas according to that book, right? So you already had an internal movement towards standardizing the law, right? Codification, particularly the way the French did it, it was new because it was also scientific. It wasn't simply listing the rules. There was an attempt to create a hierarchy of principles so that you could deduce everything from general principles. I mean, that's a slight technical difference, but from the perspective of trying to create uniform rules, that was a dynamic that was internal to the Muslim world. Colonization, of course, accelerated that dramatically, right? Because in order to interact with European powers, first of all, you needed a lot more law. There were a lot of things that interactions required in terms of legal regulation that the fuqaha simply didn't have. So European law simply solved that problem, right? But more generally, you could say that the conditions of modernity require a certain form of legality, which is legislation. So legislation, or the primacy of legislation over what you might say judge-made law. So you can consider Islamic law to be judge-made law in the sense that, muftis, legal experts made it. That was characteristic not just of Islamic law, but also other legal systems, because in the pre-modern world, change was very slow. So you didn't have a great demand for law, because most things could be solved by custom, right? But with modernity and capitalism and the rapid changes that capitalism introduces in society, you can no longer rely on custom plus judge-made law to make rules. You have to plan in advance, right? You have to, and that's what legislation does. Legislation allows you to organize society in response to problems that you recognize will happen as a result of modernity, right? So everywhere, legislation replaces custom and judge-made law. It's not just the Muslim world. So it may be true that these changes happened coincidentally with colonialism, but even if we would imagine a world in which Muslims were never colonized, if they went through modernity, they still would have had to codify and legislate, etc. So in either case, you would end up kind of in the same position where the state is the main producer of the rules rather than scholars.
I think the topic on legislation, also codification, is very important when we going to talk about political Islam or Islamism, because it's like that is what separate between those that may be going into what we call as Islamism, and also those that go beyond that to the more extreme part that reject all this codification, also legislation by state totally, and say that this is un-Islamic, and that maybe led to extremism and also the takfiri and all of that. So I think very important for us to understand that whether legislation and codification has its roots in the Islam, like you mentioned before, Prof.
Yeah, I mean, I think there are plenty of antecedents for codification and legislation in the Islamic world prior to colonialism. It's just that there was no need to use them. Because, life was a lot simpler. So the government's main business was not to make law. Right? Today, the main business of government is to make law, because that's what the conditions of modernity require. But it was potentially there because Islamic law allowed the ruler to make rules for the common good. It's just that it wasn't a pressing necessity for the ruler to organize everything. Today, you have to organize everything. You can't leave society just to be as it is. It would end up in chaos and conflict.
But I think another important question when we talk about Islamism or in the modern days, I've read some criticism about the Islamists, because you talked before about the role of ulama, the role of jurists. But when we talking about Islamism nowadays, I think that yes, they are calling to tatbiq Sharia, the implementation of law and all that. But I think like on the part of the role of ulama, the role of jurists as a check and balance and all of that. So do you think that's the lacking part on the Islamism, that they are not trying to re-establish the role of jurists or ulama?
I think the kind of Islamists you're talking about is the group that I call the utopian Islamists, who believe that if you just applied the Sharia, all our problems would be solved for one way or another. And so I call that utopian because they don't try to think of Islamic law as a practical tool of governing society. They just have this religious belief that if we're all good Muslims, everything will be fine, right? So that's a utopian belief. Now that's a separate question whether it's viable to rely on the ulama to be a check and balance on the government. I'm not so sure about that. Just again, this isn't a criticism of ulama. It's just that ulama played that role in a very different kind of polity. In the modern polity today, where you have citizens, not just subjects, so people, as a citizen, you rule and are ruled at the same time, because in theory, your voice is, your opinions, your choices, your decisions are what's shaping the rules that the government is making. So you're making the rules and you're subject to the rules at the same time. So you really need to have, if you want to work, we're talking about checks and balances, what you really need is a responsible citizenry. And so what's crucial for the effectiveness of a modern state, in my opinion, is to have a critical mass of educated citizenry committed to the public good. And so in some ways, that is much more ambitious than the pre-modern world, where what you wanted was to have a group of ulama, who's a minority, representing the majority. Now you need to have a majority of the society able to check the government. And so that's why civic education is very important. And this is where I think actually the most important role for Islam is civic education, right? Teaching people what political theorists call civic virtues of diligence, honesty, law obeying, doing one's duty, deferring gratification, sacrifice, all these kinds of virtues that are required for citizens to hold governments accountable. I think Islam teaches us through various ritual practices that we do, as well as our doctrines. And so I think that's where Islam has the most important role to play in governance, not necessarily in actually creating rules, but in producing the kinds of subjects that can be responsible citizens.
Okay, I think we're due for a short break, Prof. Okay, short break, and then we'll be back. Stay tuned. Okay, welcome back to IAIS podcast. We're still with Professor Muhammad Fadel. Just before this, we have talked about the pre-modern origin on the discourse of Islamism. So maybe, Prof, now we want to move to the real experience with Islamism in the Muslim world. I think you wrote extensively on the Arab Spring, on especially on Egypt. So how you find our real experience or our real example with Islamism in reality?
Yeah, I mean, I think there wasn't enough time in Egypt to see how things would have worked out. So Hosni Mubarak resigned in February of 2011. There was a transition. There were some elections, but the new government really never had solid footing to establish itself. And then there was a coup in 2013. But I think one thing it tells us is that if you take a party or if you take a group like the Muslim Brotherhood, I would say the Muslim Brotherhood, for much of its history, was part of what I called earlier the utopian view of political Islam. This kind of naive idea that all we need to do is make everybody good Muslim and everything will be fine. That was their slogan, Islam is the solution. And it's not quite clear, if that's the case, why you need a state at all. And I think the weakness of that political vision manifested itself when they actually won elections, because they didn't know what to do, because they hadn't really thought about the practical dimension of governing. All they thought about was applying the Sharia. And as a practical matter, that would often result in is demands for applying penalties or prohibiting things, interfering in people's personal freedoms, because that's the easiest thing to see and to manifest. Like say, oh, cinemas are haram, let's shut down the cinemas. So there are always voices to do things like that, right? But that's not what modern governing is about, right? But they didn't have a clear agenda about what they wanted to do with government. And internally, they didn't have a clear agreement on what they wanted to do. So I think that was also an important source of their failures. At the same time, I think Egyptian society was not really ready in many ways for the responsibilities of democratic governance. A lot of Egyptians believed that, and still believe, I think, that the only way forward is to have a strong ruler, and that Egypt can't afford the luxury of a free parliament and parties that debate and disagree. We need to have unity. The only way we can have unity is have an authoritarian president. So there's still this belief in what I like to call the Superman, that the Superman is going to come save us, who is smarter than us, stronger than us, better than us, and he will solve all our problems. So that's also a form of political utopianism, right? It's a superstition just as much as the belief that Islam will magically solve our problems. That both are equally superstitious. This idea in the strongman, has a certain basis in Islamic thought, as I was saying, in the pre-modern period, going, the Persianate and Turkic traditions of the man of destiny that God appoints. It kind of finds inspiration from that. You see this also in sort of Sufi views about, ilham and, inspiration and God's divine favor, etc. And it misconceives governance in the modern world, because the modern world requires the government to plan our futures and organize ourselves. It's not about simply resolving disputes between groups. So in the pre-modern period, one of the justifications for having a strong, vigorous, independent ruler like the Sultan is that justice is considered being fair to everybody. So the easiest way to be fair to everybody is if you're detached from everybody. So the ideal of a judge should have no relationship to any of the parties. The judge should be completely detached so he can be fair. So that was the same idea with the ruler. You want the ruler to have no attachments to anybody in society. So he has no personal favoritism for anybody. He's equally distant from everybody. And then he can decide who gets what, right? That might have made sense in the pre-modern world, but not today. Because today, what the state has to do is create conditions of cooperation. It has to get this wide mass of people that we call the citizenry, millions of people, to work together to improve their societies, right? So it's a completely different kind of political problem. That's why you need to have institutions that allow different groups in society to negotiate directly with each other. That's what parliaments do. Parliaments allow the different groups in society to come together on equal terms and work out solutions so they can cooperate together on their common problems, like building better roads, improving their education system, improving their healthcare, making investments to allow the economy to grow. All these things requires everybody to participate together and work together, right? That wasn't the political problem in the pre-modern world, right? So that's why, again, I would say democracy, sort of broadly conceived, is not a choice in the modern world. Everybody must be democratic if you want to have successful institutions. And so to continue to believe in political utopianism, be it of the Islamist sort or the authoritarian sort, is a kind of superstition, because it has no rational connection to the kinds of problems that we face, right? And so that's one of the chief reasons why I think the Arab Spring failed in Egypt and ultimately Tunisia too, and that people had, I would say, magical expectations. They believed that by getting rid of Mubarak or getting rid of Ben Ali, then suddenly everything would get better. But no, in what it means to live in a democratic polity, a democratic state, is that your state can only be as good as you are, right? You are the state, in a sense. And so the problems of the state are just a reflection of the problems of society. It can't be blamed on one person. And so in order to solve our problems, we have to work together. We can't expect somebody else to solve them for us. So that's what we have to, as a matter of political culture, that's what I think still needs to be fully grasped and assimilated. So I don't know. We'll see what happens.
Okay, so I say that on one side, maybe there's why this Arab Spring fail on one side is more like the lack of preparation from the Islamic movement themselves. They're not fully prepared. They just happen to see themselves in the right time, right place, and to seize the power, and then they just go for it. And also another on the other side, it's more like over expectation from the citizen, from the public, so that they expect that this Islamic movement, this Islamists can solve all the problem in their country.
Well, the two go hand in hand because that was the promise of the utopian Islamists. I mean, the utopian Islamists promised that, if we just follow the Sharia, if we're just good Muslims, then everything will be fine, right? And so they kind of conditioned people to believe this. But it's not just them. I mean, I think a lot of the political rhetoric in a place like Egypt, even from the state, sort of emphasizes this idea of the president who knows better than everybody else, who's superior to everybody else, who's going to solve our problems. And the newspapers every day is a headline of the president doing this and the president doing that, as if the president is magical, right? And so both ideas they're different conceptions of the same idea, that there's some kind of magic solution to our political problems, when there isn't, right? It requires a lot of hard work to improve the public welfare, and it takes time, right? You can't snap your fingers and fix all your problems. It's slow improvements over a long time that have a cumulative effect over a generation or 2 generations or 3 generations. So yeah, there were a lot of high expectations that couldn't have been met.
Okay, Prof. Another thing, as you mentioned quite some time about utopia and all that. So do you find this Islamist? We know they are the upright person. They are their attention is very good. Very, they want to do the right thing. But do you see that the failure is for some part because they cannot adapt to the what we call realpolitik of the how to stay in power and how to navigate, maneuver these power players in their country and all of that?
I'm not sure if that's the problem. I just think that I think at the end of the day, the social base of support wasn't wide enough. So, it's hard to rule a country if you only have 30% support. And, you can try to be as realpolitik as you wish. I mean, in fact, in a place like Egypt, a lot of people were criticizing the Muslim Brotherhood for being too realpolitik, right? So it wasn't a question of them being too idealistic, but not idealistic enough. So it's always easy, I think, to come up with criticisms like that. But I think the bottom line was that their base of support was not sufficiently large. Now, sometimes political movements make up for that by using violence, but they weren't willing to use violence, right? Which I think is a good thing. But because they were unwilling to use violence, and because their base of social support was not broad enough, it was easy for the military to take over, because there was a majority of the Egyptians were not supportive of the Muslim Brotherhood. That's true. And so in that circumstance, there was nobody to oppose the military. Now, I happen to think that was the worst possible outcome, because the military is also not capable of running the government, which is what we've seen in the last 11 years. But until there's broader commitment to democratic rule, whatever the consequences, I think it's going to be difficult to replace the military.
Okay, Prof. I think now we are moving to the post-Islamism, because in the discourse of Arab Spring, also Islamism, we somehow always compare between the case of Egypt and also the case of Tunisia. We tend to find that the Islamic movement in Tunisia, they are more successful in navigating the Arab Spring. Is it due to the fact that they are more embracing the post-Islamism version of? this?
Well, I mean, people like to say that, but at the end of the day, Tunisia ended up in the same place Egypt did, except there wasn't a military coup. It was just one person just decided to do a coup and nobody stopped him. And so I'm not quite sure what we can learn from comparing the Nahda to, let's say, the Justice and Freedom Party. I was always skeptical that Nahda was somehow more pragmatic than the Freedom and Justice Party in Egypt, and that was why they succeeded until they didn't. I think the failures of democratic transition in Egypt and Tunisia, are still need a lot of explanation. I would look a lot more to economic issues than the political decisions of either the Freedom and Justice Party or the Nahda Party, in explaining the failed transitions. I also would like to, I think, a more interesting comparison is to compare Egypt and Tunisia to Indonesia. Why did Indonesia succeed in a democratic transition post-Suharto, but not Egypt? Because in many ways, the situation in Indonesia was much worse than in Egypt. So in the late 90s, with the East Asian financial crisis, you had not just an economic slowdown, you had a depression. I think you had like a 25% drop in GDP in Indonesia. People were worried that Indonesia was going to collapse as a state, and that, I don't need to tell you, but for others who are not familiar with the region, Indonesia is a massive country, 3 time zones, 17,000 islands, over 300 ethnicities and languages. A lot of people thought that the state itself was going to collapse. Not only did it not collapse, it consolidated democracy and has been doing very well for the last 20 years. So why did Indonesia succeed and Egypt fail, right? I mean, that's a question for, I think, political scientists to consider. I personally think that one reason that helped Indonesia succeed is they did not commit themselves to making radical changes to their constitution. They took a lot more of as a society, a lot more pragmatic approach that we're just going to solve our immediate problems that are in front of us. And, let's check the box. Let's take care of this problem, this problem, this problem. In Egypt, what really sidelined the momentum of the revolution, in my opinion, was the desire to have a new constitution. And constitutional scholars, political scientists have noted that constitutional moments are fraught with tension and fraught with danger, because those are moments in time when the deepest cleavages in society manifest themselves. And oftentimes it's very hard to solve them. So we have this ideal of the people coming together and drafting a constitution and then the state moving forward. But in practice, that almost never happens, because if you try to bring the people together to draft a constitution, they can't agree. And sometimes it results in civil war, or many times it can result in civil war. And that's kind of what happened in Egypt. Whereas in Indonesia, they didn't try to replace their constitution. And so I personally think that was a very wise decision, because it allowed Indonesians to focus on their immediate practical problems rather than much larger questions. In Egypt, while the Egyptians faced myriad practical problems, they were debating really fundamental questions of identity and the future, what the future of the people would look like in a constitutional assembly, and they couldn't agree. And that just that sharpened the conflict instead of helping resolve it. So, if I could rewind the clock, I would have, prohibited reconsideration of the Constitution. We would have stuck to the old Constitution with the minor amendments that were made.
Okay, Prof. I think next question is more on the reflection. What you think the way forward? Because the larger impact of the failure of the Arab Spring, they are now calling it even Arab Winter. So how do you find this failure impact the discourse on Islamism, Islamic movement at large in the world? Maybe they will go to try another approach in Islamism, or
Yeah, I mean, I'm not really sure. I haven't followed closely what Egyptian Islamists, for example, are saying. I do know that you have states that are trying to articulate their own conception of political Islam, which is based on, nobody calls it political Islam, but it is, in that it's trying to create or convince Muslims that it's their religious duty to always obey the rulers no matter what the rulers say or do. That is a conception of politics, right? And so if we were truly in a post-Islamist moment, then there would be no need for such a doctrine. But as I said at the beginning of this podcast, because Islam is inherently a political religion, you have to have an answer to what makes the government legitimate. And the proof of that is the fact that there are governments trying to convince Muslims that despotism is fine. I don't think they'll be very successful with that. I mean, you can use a lot of violence against people, but I don't think you're going to convince people that despotism is a good idea. So I don't know. I mean, that's kind of the most important post-Arab Spring development, the attempt to create a form of religion that is friendly to despotism. But I see that as a failure, and it's not going to go anywhere. What groups like the Nahda have learned, the Islamic Brotherhood, the Muslim Brotherhood in Egypt have learned, I'm not quite sure. Because I don't really see, I don't think they ever really transitioned properly from social movements that were concerned with the moral reform of the people, which was a good thing, perfectly fine, to a governing party with clear political priorities, a clear vision of why we need the state and what the state's going to do, what are the priorities of the state. So it's still too much ideology, right, from my perspective. When we need a lot more, questions like, how are we going to raise taxes to spend on schools and education and roads and infrastructure, right? How are we going to improve our position in global trade? What is it that we can export to earn hard currency? These are the kinds of questions that are really existential questions. It's not clear to me that Muslim political movements have any answers to those.
okay, bro. Last question. You talked just now about democratic transition and all. So, how do you find the problem of that facing democracy itself nowadays? We know the rise of the far right and also the rise of identity politics, a lot of sort of problem. So, how do you find this phenomena, and how it will affect the Islamic world?
It's deeply discouraging. Although I would point out that the collapse of the Arab Spring was in no small part due to the Islamophobia of the West and the Islamophobes in the West teaming up with domestic Islamophobes in the Arab world. And a lot of the far-right reaction in the United States and Europe and Canada is driven by fear of Muslims. The idea that liberal democracy is bad because it gives Muslim freedoms, right? There's this notion, unfortunately, that freedoms are good until Muslims use them. And then as soon as Muslims start using them, we have to get rid of those freedoms, right? And that practically in fact, has fueled the flames of reaction to democracy. So I view the democratic deficit in the Muslim world to be organically connected to the decline of democracy in the West, because they constitute each other, right? And so the answer to the rise of the far right is more democracy. We insist on democracy. because we insist on self-respect, and a person is not living in despotism is not consistent with the dignity that God has given people, right? Human beings are self-governing, sort of by nature. God has made them self-governing, and so their governments need to reflect that. Um, and so um, the rise of the far right is in part um, a desire to see Muslims not be self-governing, and so the best way to combat that is to have successful democracies in the Muslim world. I mean, it's not going to be the immediate answer, but it will go a long way to defeating it. So
Okay, I think we'll end with that note. Once again, thank you very much, Professor Muhammad Fadel, for coming to our podcast today. I think we have a very good discussion. I have benefited a lot from your discussion, Prof. So I think that's all. Until we meet again on our next episode of IAIS podcast. Is that Assalamualaikum warahmatullahi wabarakatuh.